summer 1944, Cherbourg, France. For captured German women POWs, the American prison camps were a stunning paradise on earth. They had been told to expect only cruelty. A young signals assistant braced for the worst. Instead, she was given soap and a clean towel. She saw peaches from a tin for the first time in years. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a rule, it was a reality. But this shocking kindness held a dangerous secret. It was a mercy that would one day turn into a weapon used against them. What happens when an enemy's mercy makes you an outcast in your own home? Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. In the dusty summer of 1944, the French port of Cherbourg was a place of endings. For a group of German women auxiliaries, some still teenagers, it was the end of their war. Rounded up by American soldiers, they climbed into the backs of canvas-covered trucks with a cold knot of dread in their stomachs. Every warning they had ever received from their commanders, every chilling radio broadcast, echoed in their minds. The propaganda was clear and absolute. The Americans were monsters. They would be treated not as soldiers, but as spoils of war, worse than beasts. The journey to the holding camp was quiet, punctuated only by the rumble of the engine and the muffled sobs of the youngest girls. Among them was Ilse Weber, a 20-year-old signals assistant from the Luftwaffe. She sat straight, her spine rigid with a practiced discipline that did little to calm the fear in her heart. She was a captured soldier, an enemy, and she knew what that was supposed to mean. She steeled herself for the jeers, the shoves, the humiliation that had been promised. When the truck stopped, the women were ordered out into a sprawling field of canvas tents. Ilse noticed something odd right away. The tents were arranged in neat, orderly rows. There were markings on them, tags from an organization she recognized from posters, the International Red Cross. This was not the chaotic, brutal camp of her nightmares. It was organized. It was quiet. The American guards did not shout. They pointed, giving simple directions with a detached efficiency. There was no mockery in their eyes, only a weary professionalism. Ilse and the other women were led into a large processing tent, where they lined up, expecting to be stripped of their belongings and their dignity. But again, the expected cruelty never came. Instead, a soldier set a crate on a wooden table. He began handing out items: a bar of soap, a small clean towel. To Ilse, who had not held a full bar of soap in over a year, it felt heavier than a brick. It was a simple object, but it was a promise of something she had given up on: basic human decency. The true shock came minutes later, in the mess line. Hot stew was ladled into metal trays, followed by a thick slice of bread. As Ilse moved down the line, a soldier opened a large tin can. The scent that filled the air was so foreign, so sweet, that she stopped walking. It was the smell of peaches, sliced peaches in thick, golden syrup. She hadn't even seen fresh fruit in 3 years, let alone something so luxurious. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was suddenly overshadowed by a profound sense of confusion. This was not the food of a prison. This was the food of a forgotten life. A young GI, a boy who looked no older than her own brother, held a ladle, ready to spoon the fruit onto her tray. Seeing her hesitation, he gestured for her to move forward. He spoke in slow, careful English, the words so unexpected they felt like a physical blow. "Ma'am, after you. Ma'am." He had called her ma'am. Not a slur, not an insult, not even her prisoner number. A word of respect. Ilse's training, her discipline, the years of propaganda. It all faltered in that single, unbelievable moment. That night, lying on a cot in the quiet darkness of the tent, Ilse could not sleep. The thin wool blanket was clean. The air was free of the familiar sounds of sirens and artillery. Beside her, another girl slept soundly for the first time in weeks, her fear finally exhausted. Ilse replayed the day in her mind, the orderliness of the camp, the absence of shouting, the quiet dignity of the guards. She thought of the Red Cross tags, a sign of rules and regulations. She thought of the warm food, the impossible sweetness of the peaches, and the impossible courtesy of the American boy who had served them. The German radio had screamed for years that capture was a fate worse than death, a pit of shame and cruelty from which no one returned. But what she had experienced was something else entirely. It was humane. It was fair. It was a world turned upside down. She turned her head on the stiff pillow and saw the silhouette of her friend, awake and staring at the canvas ceiling. Ilse barely recognized her own voice when she spoke, a whisper that hung in the silent tent, filled with a question that would follow her for the rest of her life. "If this is prison," she asked, "what was freedom?" By August 1944, the journey had taken on a dreamlike quality. After crossing the Atlantic in the cavernous hold of a transport ship, Ilse and the nearly 400 other German women found themselves on a train, rattling through a landscape greener and vaster than anything she had ever seen. They were heading deep into the American South, to a place called Camp Aliceville in Alabama. As the train slowed, pulling into the small town, the women peered through the windows, their apprehension returning. Crowds had gathered at the station, their faces turned toward the train cars. Ilse braced herself for the hatred they had been warned about, for the spitting and the curses that were the right of the victors. But the faces watching them were not filled with hate. They were curious, bewildered, some even showing flickers of sympathy. The people of Aliceville stared as if they were seeing ghosts, not monsters. The convoy of trucks that took them the final miles to the camp moved through the silent, watching town without a single hostile act. The structured humanity they had first witnessed in France was not an anomaly. It was official policy. Under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, a set of international rules for war, every prisoner was guaranteed certain rights. They were to receive the same quantity and quality of food as the American troops stationed at the base. They were entitled to medical care, to male privileges, and to be treated with dignity. This system was especially meticulous when it came to the small, almost unheard-of population of female German POWs. Out of more than 400,000 German prisoners held in the United States by 1945, fewer than 1,000 were women, most of them auxiliaries like Ilse. For camp commandants, avoiding any hint of scandal or mistreatment was a top priority. Captain Robert Ellis, the man in charge of Camp Aliceville, was a lawyer by training, and he ran his camp by the book. Restraint was not a suggestion, it was an order. The first days at Aliceville were a series of quiet shocks that systematically dismantled years of propaganda. The women were issued new clothing, not coarse prison uniforms, but simple cotton dresses and sturdy, comfortable shoes. The items were plain, but clean, a uniform of normalcy that felt more liberating than any freedom Ilse had known under the Reich. But the greatest shock was the weekly shower. In a long, concrete building, rows of showerheads delivered an endless supply of hot water. For women who had not felt truly clean since 1942, who had been accustomed to rationing every drop of cold water, the experience was overwhelming. Standing under the steaming spray, scrubbing their skin with fragrant American soap, many of them wept. They cried silently, letting the water mix with their tears, washing away years of grime, fear, and exhaustion. One woman, clutching a small Bible given to her by a chaplain, later found a blank margin and wrote a sentence that captured their shared disbelief. "They gave us white bread with butter," she wrote. "We were told America was starving." The memory of the booming voice from the Nazi radio broadcasts grew fainter with each passing day. "Women in enemy hands will vanish into shame," the voice had promised. But here, shame was a foreign concept. In the mess hall, the American guards, young men who could have been their brothers or sons, had a simple, unwritten rule. When the women entered, the guards would stand back, waiting until every prisoner had her food before they served themselves. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of their humanity that spoke louder than any threat. The constant fear that had been their companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of safety. And in that safety, something remarkable began to happen. A laugh, at first startled and quickly suppressed, then another. Soon, the low murmur of conversation in the barracks was punctuated by genuine, open laughter. One evening, as the sun set over the Alabama pines, one of the older women, a former matron named Marta Klein, began to quietly sing a German lullaby. The soft, familiar melody drifted through the camp. Ilse closed her eyes, letting the song transport her home. Then she heard another sound, a clumsy, out-of-tune humming that joined the lullaby. It was one of the guards, a young sergeant named James Carter, leaning against a post, a slight smile on his face. He did not know the words, but he knew the peace in the music. In that moment, there were no prisoners, no guards, only a shared song in the twilight. The months melted into a season, and the sharp edges of captivity softened into the predictable rhythms of a strange, new life. At Camp Aliceville, the days were filled not with idleness, but with purpose. The women were put to work, their tasks simple and humane. They sat in large, airy rooms, sewing uniforms for their fellow prisoners or mending clothes for the U.S. Army. Others worked outdoors in the vast Alabama fields, harvesting peanuts under the warm Sunday. They even formed a camp choir, their German hymns rising into the humid evening air, a sound of defiant beauty in an unlikely place. For their labor, they were paid. Not in American dollars, but in camp coupons, 80 cents for a full day's work. This scrip became their currency of dignity. At the camp's post-exchange, or PX, they could use these coupons to buy small treasures that felt like monumental luxuries: toothpaste, a bar of chocolate, writing paper to send letters home. Ilse watched as some of the younger women, their faces bright with a forgotten sense of self, pooled their coupons to buy a tube of lipstick, sharing it to bring a touch of color and femininity back to their lives. One evening, while writing a letter she hoped would one day reach her family, Ilse paused. She looked at the clean paper, the well-fed women around her, and the quiet safety of the barracks. A thought, sharp and treasonous, came to her, and she wrote it down in the margin of a book so she would not forget. "We lived better as captives," she wrote, "than as citizens under Hitler." Her experience was not an accident of fate, but the result of a meticulously managed system. By 1945, the US was holding over 425,000 German prisoners of war across the country, but the fewer than 1,000 women in their custody were a special case. The U.S. Army was determined to avoid any accusation of misconduct. At camps like Aliceville, fraternization rules between guards and prisoners were absolute, with any violation punishable by court-martial. Regular, unannounced inspections by the International Red Cross ensured that the standards of the Geneva Convention were not just met, but exceeded. Captain Ellis's adherence to procedure was unwavering. Mercy was the policy, and the policy was strictly enforced. Then, in 1946, the world changed again. The war was over, and the long process of repatriation began. A current of excitement and nervous energy ran through the camp. The women packed their meager belongings, the simple cotton dresses and sturdy shoes they had been given. They were going home. They dreamed of tearful reunions, of falling into the arms of mothers and fathers, husbands and brothers. They imagined sharing their stories of survival, of the unexpected kindness they had received in a foreign land, but the Germany they returned to was not the one they had left. Hamburg, for Ilse, was a city of ghosts, a landscape of rubble and gaunt, silent people. The welcome she had longed for never came. Instead, there was a cold, impenetrable silence from those who had endured the firebombing, the starvation, and the final, brutal collapse of the Reich. In her small apartment, Ilse carefully unpacked a souvenir she had treasured, the paper wrapper from a bar of American soap. She had kept it as a reminder of her first taste of dignity in captivity. Now, she hid it at the bottom of a drawer, as if it were a mark of shame. Her neighbors, their faces etched with hunger and loss, would whisper just loud enough for her to hear. "She had an American paradise," they said, "while we starved in the ruins." Another woman from her unit later confessed that she could never bring herself to tell her own mother about the peaches. Her mother had collected all the letters she had sent from America, a thick bundle tied with string, and buried them in the garden, unread. The stories of good food and fair treatment were not a comfort. They were an insult. They were a betrayal. The mercy that had saved Ilse's spirit now isolated her. She began to doubt everything she had experienced. Was the kindness of the guards real, or was it just a clever strategy? Was America's adherence to the rules a mark of moral superiority, or simply another weapon of war designed to weaken enemy resolve? She had survived, but in doing so, she had become a stranger to her own people, haunted by a question she could not answer. What happens when an enemy's mercy makes you an outcast in your own home? For decades, Ilse Weber did not speak of the peaches. She did not speak of the hot showers, the clean cotton dresses, or the polite young guard who called her ma'am. To speak of such things in the ruins of post-war Germany was to invite contempt. The women who returned from American captivity learned quickly that their story was an unwelcome one. It was a story that did not fit the national narrative of suffering and victimhood. While their countrymen had endured years of Allied bombing, starvation, and the final, bloody defense of their homeland, they had been safe. They had been well fed. They had been treated with a humanity that felt, in retrospect, like a form of accusation, and so they sat with their shame in silence. The official histories of the war made no mention of them, a footnote so small as to be invisible. Many of the women, fearing the charge of collaboration, took their pasts and buried them. Diaries were burned in stoves, their pages of disbelief and cautious hope turning to ash. Letters from America, once read and reread in secret, were torn into pieces. The memory of mercy became a private burden, a hidden truth that could not be shared, even with their closest family. It was a strange and lonely exile, to be shamed not for a crime committed, but for a kindness received. Years turned into decades. The rubble was cleared, cities were rebuilt, and the world moved on. The quiet women of Camp Aliceville grew old, but history has a long memory, and the truth, however deeply buried, often finds its way to the light. In archives in Washington and Geneva, historians began to sift through mountains of declassified documents. They found U.S. Army reports, meticulously detailed logs kept by men like Captain Robert Ellis, which outlined daily routines, food rations, and the strict enforcement of prisoner rights. They uncovered the extensive records of the International Red Cross, whose inspectors had made regular visits to the camps, documenting conditions with impartial precision. And slowly, as the generation that fought the war began to pass away, a few of the women finally felt safe enough to speak. Their testimonies, given in quiet living rooms to patient interviewers, were remarkably consistent. They confirmed the official records, adding the human details the paper files could never capture. The taste of white bread with butter, the sound of a guard humming a German lullaby, the profound shock of being treated not as the enemy, but as a person. The evidence was overwhelming. Their experience was not a collective fantasy or a trick of memory. The restraint and fairness they had encountered had been real, consistent, and a matter of deliberate policy. It did not erase the other cruelties of the war, but it stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the myths of their youth. One cool autumn afternoon, Ilse, now in her late 70s with hands knotted by age, sat with her granddaughter in her small, tidy apartment. The girl, curious about a past her grandmother so rarely mentioned, asked about the war. For the first time, Ilse did not change the subject. She spoke of the fear, the hunger, and the propaganda. Then, her voice softening, she told a story the girl had never heard. She spoke of a day in France, in a field of canvas tents, when she had been given a tin of peaches. She described the scent, the sweetness, the way the syrup felt in her mouth after years of deprivation. "I thought I was dreaming," Ilse said, her eyes looking far away. "It was the first time I believed the war could actually end. The first time I believed there was something other than hate left in the world." Her granddaughter listened, her expression thoughtful. She tried to reconcile this story with the black and white images of soldiers and bombed-out cities she had seen in her history books. She finally asked the question that had hung over Ilse's life for more than 50 years. "So it was a paradise?" she asked. Ilse turned, a faint, complicated smile touching her lips. "For one moment, yes," she whispered. Paradise, in prison. That single moment held the entire truth of her story. It was not about politics or military strategy. It was about the stubborn, resilient power of human decency in the face of absolute inhumanity. The system that had captured Ilse was built on an idea that certain rules of conduct must be upheld, even toward an enemy who had discarded them. It was a choice to answer brutality, not with more brutality, but with restraint. This choice, enacted in small gestures by thousands of ordinary soldiers in camps across America, was its own form of battle. It was a fight to prove that a nation's strength could be measured not just by its power to destroy, but by its capacity for mercy. In the end, the real victory was not over enemies, but over cruelty itself.